Good afternoon, class. This is Laura. I am your instructor, and I am here to give you a brief introduction to the goniometer. And that is just a fancy word for a device that we use to measure the range of motion of a joint. Gonia means angle, and meter means metron. So those are two Greek words that are put together into one word, goniometer, and it just basically means measuring the angle of a joint. There are several different goniometers available out there, and they're all different sizes. I have a few for you guys to see. This is one of the larger ones, if not the largest. It's pretty standard in what most therapists use to measure the larger joints of our body. So the neck, the hip, the knee, the elbow, quite possibly. This would be an appropriate goniometer to measure all of those joints. And then these two are about the same size, and so those are typical goniometers to measure the wrist, so your wrist flexion, extension, radial, and ulnar deviation. And then there's this little guy here, and that's to measure the ranges of our fingers and our thumb. But just for today's purposes, I wanted to use this one here because y'all can see it better through video. But no matter the size of the goniometer, the three parts of it are always the same. So let's talk about the parts. There is this part here, it's a rivet, and that is the axis of the goniometer. And then there are two arms. You have your stationary arm and your movable arm, right? And so as you'll see on the printout, you would align this where the printout tells you to align it. So the axis of the goniometer aligns with the axis of the joint, and then you align the stationary part of the goniometer along the stationary part of the joint that you're moving. And then the movable part, or the movable arm, lines up with the movable part of the body that you're measuring. And so usually it's the distal part, and this is the proximal part. So if you're measuring the elbow, then this would be this would align with the proximal upper extremity. This would align up at the lateral epicondyle, and this one would align with the distal upper extremity or the forearm. Okay. And also, while we're here talking about the parts of the goniometer, you want to make sure that you're using one that's pretty stiff. So you can see I'm moving this around, and this movable arm is staying in position, which is really handy to have. You don't want one that's loose and floppy, because when you take it off of the joint and you're reading it for, to get the number, you don't want this to be moving around and then get a bad reading. So if that happens, chunk it and get a new one, or you can even get a hammer and lightly tap that little rivet to tighten it back up, and that works too. So just make sure that this is pretty stiff and it's not a floppy old goniometer, just so that your measurements are a little bit more accurate. And so let's talk a little bit more about the goniometer, and then we'll be done. But I wanted to point out these numbers. So I'm not sure if you can see that. It's probably backwards for you guys, but basically along this circle are little numbers. And so on this side of the goniometer, it reads from 0 in increments of 10 all the way up to 180 degrees. And then same thing this way. It goes from 0 to 180 degrees. And then there's also some red numbers on the outside, and it reads basically, let's see, 0 to 90 degrees this way and 0 to 90 degrees this way. And then even on the inside, there's more red numbers, and it reads 180 degrees to 360 and 180 degrees to 360 this way. That can be really, really confusing to every therapist and every assistant. It does get better with practice. So I would highly recommend that you practice some more, because you want to be able to just really quickly look at that goniometer and be able to write down the range pretty fast. So just some helpful tips for that. It's good to know your typical range of motions for each joint, or available range of motions for each joint. You'll find that in your reading, and I want you to go ahead and write that down on your printouts, what the typical range for each joint is. So for, let's see, cervical flexion and extension, I want you to write down the normal range of 0 to 55, and so on and so forth. So that will help you know if you're looking at your goni and you're like, well, it could either be 100 degrees here or it could be 80. I'm not sure which one. Well, first you need to say, well, what's the typical range of motion? And so what makes sense? And then you could also think to yourself, you know, well, if, for example, the shoulder is, you know, abduction is 0 to 180 degrees, and I'm right, you know, right about here, would it be more accurate to say that I'm at 45 degrees or 135? So just kind of, you know, guesstimating where they're at range of motion wise will help you to figure out which side of the goniometer to look at. But you know, even us most experienced therapists will have to look at it a couple of times just to make sure that we've got it right, but it does get faster the more experienced that you are. So if you guys have any questions, please just shoot me an email or ask a question in your discussion board groups. Perhaps a student might know the answer, and if not, I'll be checking in every now and again, or you can even give me a phone call. You've got my office number available to you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. I do suggest you make sure that you read that chapter in your book and know your bony landmarks, because that will let you know where the axis of each joint is, and then also know those typical range of motions for each joint. And then I suggest that you just practice as much as you can. There's how-to videos for measuring each range of the neck in this unit, so check those out, and I think that you're good to go other than that. But again, if you have questions, just let me know. Y'all have a good day. Thanks.